Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Just wrapped up talking some Chiefs Super Bowl parade talk and sort of the storylines that came out of that as far as Chris Jones wanting to stay and the financial implications really that sort of come with that. And, we will, like I mentioned, continue to be monitoring that. But moving on to our next segment here, talking about the 49ers, who yesterday announced that they would not be bringing back their defensive coordinator, Steve Wilks. Shanahan was on a conference call with reporters and said that they were going to be parting ways with him. Wilks was with the 49ers for just one season, and this was a little bit of a controversial move. Obviously, anytime a team loses in the Super Bowl, their decision-making following that is going to be a little bit under a microscope. But I did think that this was a very interesting and not in a great way move. Now, it sounds like from what Shanahan was talking about, it was based off of the fit with Steve Wilks, and that could mean a couple different things. It could mean some more personality. I know that the schemes, there was a difference in between what Shanahan was comfortable with, typically with DeMeco Ryans, and I think that Robert Saleh, when he was the defensive coordinator of the 49ers as well, sort of ran a similar scheme, and Wilks didn't perfectly fit into that same style of play, but pretty interesting. I mean, Wilks and this 49ers defense had a pretty good season where, in terms of rankings, maybe they dropped from last season to this year, where the Niners were first in 2022 with DeMeco Ryans. That is, they were first in scoring and yards on defense. They were second in takeaways under DeMeco Ryans then. This year, it's interesting because they dipped in terms of the rankings, like I mentioned, but not a tremendous amount across the board. They were third in scoring, 8th in yards allowed, 5th in takeaways. So still top 10 in all of these different categories. It gets interesting if you look at the actual numbers from those past couple seasons with DeMeco Ryans to this year. Despite the rankings being worse under Wilks, all of these statistics were actually better, which I'll lay them out and then I guess sort of give my interpretation of it, where points per game went from 18.9 under DeMeco Ryans to 17.5, that is points allowed. Yards per game allowed went down just slightly, but from 305 to 304. And then takeaways were actually up from 1.5 to 1.7. So again, a little bit of marginal numbers there, but technically, statistically better. Also worse in rankings. And you also look across the league where offense was down this year. So everything's relative. One way or another, though, it means that the defense under Steve Wilks was at least on par with the defense under DeMeco Ryans. And I also think that Wilks dealt with, a little bit of adversity through the year as well. They bring in Javon Hargrave this offseason, who had a big season for them. They trade for Chase Young and add him as a piece as well. But I've talked about it plenty of times, maybe a little bit too much on this show. Talanoa Hufanga isn't necessarily recognized as, that top tier safety in the league, but I think he's very much in that vicinity. I think that he is a real game changer for that 49ers defense on the back end. And surrounding him, there is a lot of youth in that secondary, which is just sort of interesting because of the schemes and the way that they're able to play these games. It seemed like they were trying to sort of, you look at the trade deadline, instead of going out to add some secondary, which I know there wasn't a ton of secondary help necessarily across the league. The Eagles traded for Kevin Byard and sort of Bayard's a good player. His best years are behind him, though, and you didn't really hear much of him on Philadelphia. You had Rasul Douglas, the Bills trading for him from the Packers, but all in all, it's not like there was a tremendous amount of help out there at the secondary position, but what they did see was an advantage, or an opportunity, I should say, to capitalize on what they thought was the strength of their defense, which was the pass rush and the front seven, where they go and they bring in Chase Young. And, Chase Young, not spectacular this season, but, he was good in the Super Bowl. He got to Mahomes for one of those sacks, and, the 49ers were putting pressure on Mahomes for a lot of that game, which is sort of takes me into this next conversation here of how did the defense hold up in the playoffs. Now, again, a couple different ways you can look at this, because they were very solid in the Super Bowl against Mahomes and the Chiefs. There's really not all too much you can do against Mahomes. Just ridiculous stuff that he is doing right now, especially in terms of end of game drives. I saw some stat, and this isn't exact because I'm just recalling it off the top of my head, but Mahomes is something like 7-4-7, I should say, on drives in which his team is trailing in the Super Bowl, or there's like some sort of fourth quarter clutch time stat. Again, I'm very unprepared right now. Maybe shouldn't have even brought it up, but just time and time again, we've seen Mahomes be able to come up in big moments, and you really can't kill Steve Wilks or that defense for allowing those last couple drives. Before the overtime touchdown, I believe the only touchdown that the Chiefs scored in that game was off of the muffed punt, which gave them possession at the 14-yard line. And, this is also considering the fact that they lost one of their best defenders, best players on the team, period, really, too, Dre Greenlaw, early in that game with just a freak injury. And, we talked about Oren Burks just wasn't really ready for that moment yet, necessarily just being thrown into it like he was. And obviously Mahomes is a smart enough quarterback that was able to take advantage of a backup linebacker, especially against a defensive group that was also very reliant on their linebackers to make plays to help relieve some of the pressure on their secondary. And it was just an unfortunate loss. Now, that's the Super Bowl itself, obviously the biggest of big games, and that's what we will look to first is, well, they're not the reason why they lost that Super Bowl. Why do you fire him? I agree. I want to make it clear, I don't think they should have fired Steve Wilks, but their defense wasn't great the first couple rounds. They were getting run all over. Between the Packers game and the Lions game, they allowed both of these teams to get off to hot starts and sort of forced Shanahan and this offense to climb their way back into these games. But again, I don't think you can fully put it on Steve Wilks here. And, Wilks is somebody that I think over the past couple seasons hasn't had it completely easy. He comes in as defensive coordinator for the 49ers here, which is, a big job, definitely high expectations. You saw the past two defensive coordinators that worked with the Niners went on to get head coaching jobs in Ryans and Saleh. But last year, part of the reason why he gets this defensive coordinator job is based off of the job that he did as the interim head coach for the Carolina Panthers last year after they fired... Which coach was it? Because Steichen was... No, it wasn't Steichen this year. That was the Colts. I don't know. Steve Wilks takes over as interim head coach for the Panthers last year and sort of helps to... Was that the Matt Rule year? I'm totally blanking on this right now. It could have been when Matt Rule was fired. The Panthers have had a lot of coaches as of late. So, Wilks takes over and sort of helps elevate that Panthers team down the stretch of the season, and ultimately enough to prove himself to be worthy of a defensive coordinator position. He leaves, and obviously roster a big issue there in Carolina, but the Panthers were terrible this year. And, I mean, they did still have a good defense as well, but, you know, I just think that it's a little bit of, I'm not sure if it's making Wilks the scapegoat for this amongst all of the criticism for Shanahan at this moment. I mean, I'm curious where the decision really came from between Shanahan's the head coach. Did he want to move on from Wilks himself? He's obviously the one with the reporters delivering the news, but was this a John Lynch decision, their general manager? I don't know. I'm very interesting to see I don't know how many answers we really are going to get, at least on that front. And this obviously sort of ties in because we're talking about now after the Super Bowl, a lot of these teams have already hired some of the top candidates out there that they're not getting the first pick as far as a replacement for Steve Wilks. And here we are, coming off of a very successful season once again. It's not always just about the championship because only one team can win a ring. So I would consider this to be a successful year for the Niners. But now you're sort of gambling, making this risk late in the coaching cycle of trying to make a change at a position where I don't think you were necessarily short-handed. Now, obviously, the people in the room of the front office and within the coaching staff know way more than you or I possibly could about what's going on behind the scenes there. So it's a little unfair of us to, fully pin this as this is just McVay trying to blame somebody else for this loss, because I don't think that that's even an argument anybody could really make. Like, how could you say the defense lost the 49ers this Super Bowl? For as smart as Shanahan is, and we know that he's at least, somewhat football smart. He's very football smart, but I know he has a lot of critics now, but, he, as a football mind, could not have watched that game back and been like, it is the defense's fault that we lost this game. Because I don't know, it's a crazy concept to me. So again, I don't think that it was full scapegoat mode here, because I don't think that there's really an argument to be made. It's not throwing someone under the bus when there was no really cause for thinking that it possibly could have been on Steve Wilks, that game in particular. But I don't know. I mean, from what it sounds like, there were ups and downs with Wilks and that coaching staff throughout the season. Wilks started the year up in the coach's booth to call these games. Shanahan asked him to come down to the field for the latter half of the year. And again, it sounds like sort of the scheme fit was something that was a little bit of a concern to Shanahan, maybe to other coaches on the defensive staff, maybe to GM John Lynch. So again, whether or not we'll get answers to that, I'm not totally sure, but I am very curious to see who they come away with as their new defensive coordinator. I'm going to have to look into who the top options out there even still are, because I feel like this was a pretty heavy defensive, as far as coaching cycle goes. I feel like we saw a good amount of defensive coaches get promotions to head coach jobs more than sort of the recent trend of seeing a lot of offensive guys. There obviously were still offensive guys, but a lot of defensive guys that got opportunities. So we will see how this all sort of plays out, but we are going to be taking our second break. When we come back on the other side, we will be sticking with football. We're going to be talking about Justin Fields. Yesterday, I mentioned that was the biggest storyline in the coming off season. We're going to be diving a little bit more into that and talking about the potential landing spots for him. So stick with us.